In the final decades of the Republic, the Trade Federation was the most powerful corporation in the galaxy, a private empire that controlled much of the Outer Rim. It had vast private armies, a fleet of deadly battleships, sovereign rule over numerous planets, and exclusive trade agreements with countless more, and it even had Senate representation. This powerful corporation played a major role in the fall of the Republic, as you surely know, and today we're going to examine it in detail, providing an overview of the corporation structure, what it did to turn a profit, and how it rose to power.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Unlike others among the galaxy's most infamous corporations, the Trade Federation was a fairly new organization. It was founded during the later stages of the Great Peace of the Republic in 350 BBY, a time when the Republic's centuries-long golden age was beginning to fade. In this period, the Republic was increasingly beset by dysfunction and internal crises, particularly in the Outer Rim, and these problems were worsened by squabbling between the megacorporations that controlled shipping in the Outer Rim at the time. Companies like Quasar Cargo, Red Star Shipping Lanes, Pulsar Supertanker, and Aurora Transportation were hindering trade by refusing to share navigational data and blacklisting their competitors from spaceports across the Outer Rim, causing inefficiencies and preventing numerous remote systems from getting the trade they needed to stay afloat. The Trade Federation was originally brought into being to solve these problems. Originally a Republic-chartered organization founded by a fairly diverse group of colonies-based trade interests, the Trade Federation's task was to mediate between the shipping cartels and to resolve disputes and curb the corporate abuses that were worsening the situation in the Outer Rim. Initially, it did its job quite well. It not only put a stop to the squabbling between the shipping cartels, but it also negotiated to improve shipping rates and make the policies of the various trading firms more efficient. As it grew increasingly successful, however, it evolved far beyond the task it had originally been chartered for, becoming a powerful shipping cartel in its own rights. It bought out several of the corporations it had been tasked with regulating, among them Pulsar Supertanker, and it offered numerous smaller companies membership in the organization, taking cuts of their profits in exchange for access to the Federation's increasingly vast resource pool. By 250 BBY, a century after the corporation was founded, the Trade Federation had more or less abandoned its original mission, morphing into a lobbying group that pushed the Senate to pass policy that favored the interests of the galaxy's shipping firms. All the while, it continued to expand its own shipping operations. The Federation built a merchant fleet of its own and began improving the Outer Rim's shipping infrastructure, establishing the Trade Explorer Corps to blaze new hyperspace routes and building spaceports, way stations, brokerage houses, depots, and retail outlets on thousands of planets across the galaxy. As the scourge of piracy became an increasingly major problem in the Outer Rim, one that most Outer Rim planetary security forces were too weak or corrupt to properly deal with, the Trade Federation also established the Trade Defense Force, a private navy that defended Trade Federation shipping convoys. By 200 BBY, the Trade Federation had become one of the most powerful shipping cartels in the galaxy, but its power was initially seen as a good thing by the Republic. It did a good job representing its members' interests, it greatly improved infrastructure and the flow of commerce in the Outer Rim, put an end to the disputes that had been hindering trade in the region previously, and its disciplined, well-funded, and highly effective private military helped the Judicials and PSFs battle pirates in some of the galaxy's most troubled sectors. Indeed, the champions of privatization and deregulation cited the Trade Federation as an example of an ideal Republic institution, a force for good in the galaxy. Whether that was truly the case is questionable, but all but the Trade Federation's staunchest partisans would acknowledge that, at the very least, it didn't stay that way. The Trade Federation ultimately became what it had been created to regulate, a powerful, monopolistic shipping cartel that crushed its competitors and valued profit above all else. Now that we've covered where the Trade Federation came from, it's time to talk about its structure. By 200 BBY, the Trade Federation had become a vast conglomerate with branches all over the galaxy, particularly in the Outer Rim. It had bought up or allied with all manner of smaller corporations over the years, and some of these continued to function semi-independently under Trade Federation purview, among them Ket Shipping, Transtech Droid Works, Pulsar Supertanker, Davala Mining, Horschkessel Drive Inc., Cotillery Transports Limited, the Ma'ar Shaddam Weaponsmith Guild, Resec Hull Space, and Bactoid Armor Workshop. Other companies that the Trade Federation acquired were directly incorporated into the cartel or liquidated. Either way, the Trade Federation had influence over numerous aspects of the galactic economy, from mining to the manufacturing of weapons, droids, and starships. Its focus, however, remained on shipping, and the Trade Federation made most of its annual profits through its control of trade across the galaxy. The Trade Federation had installations on thousands of worlds, from spaceports and warehouses to way stations and military bases. Many of these worlds signed exclusive trade agreements with the Federation, giving the corporation complete control of trade to and from hundreds of star systems, and it had major shares in trade virtually everywhere else. Apart from its military, its most important asset was the enormous Trade Federation merchant fleet, an enormous armada of bulk freighters built by Horschkessel and owned by the Trade Federation, the most famous ships of which were the 3-kilometer-long Lucrehulk class LH-3210 cargo freighters. Most of the internal hierarchy and structure of the Trade Federation is unknown. What is known, however, is that all various branches, subsidiaries, and component bureaucracies of the Trade Federation entered to the Trade Federation Directorate, the corporation's ruling council. The Directorate consisted of 7 members, one of which held the position of Viceroy. The Viceroy of the Trade Federation was the overall leader of the organization and the chairman of the Directorate. The Viceroy was the most powerful individual in the Trade Federation, but the Directorate as a whole still held most of the governing power within the corporation, and the Viceroy only operated as its representative. In the prequel era, the Trade Federation was pretty much synonymous with the Neimoidians, who controlled virtually the entire corporation during the Republic's final decade. But for most of its history, the Trade Federation was actually pretty diverse. From the beginning, there were many Neimoidians in the Trade Federation, and Neimoidian shipping firms had been among the corporation's founding members, but many of the Federation's other founding interests were dominated by members of other species, albeit mostly ones with strong presences in the colony's region. As a result, until the final decades of Republic history, the Trade Federation's leaders and personnel were a mix of humans, Duros, Neimoidians, Grand Celestians, Volpterines, and members of a few other species, with humans being the majority for most of the group's history. Before the events of the Eriadu Summit in 33 BBY, the Trade Federation Directorate consisted of 1 Neimoidian plus 1 Gran, 1 Celestin, and 4 humans, 2 from Kuat and the others from Filve and Balmora. Nonetheless, the Neimoidians played a major role in the Trade Federation throughout its history. Neimoidians within the organization made up the Neimoidian faction, which had its own unofficial leaders and slowly took over the Trade Federation during the Republic's final century. The Trade Federation's Neimoidian faction actually played a major role in the Neimoidian government. The Inner Circle, which ruled Neimoidian space from Neimoidia, was led by the highest-ranking Neimoidian in the Trade Federation, meaning that a Neimoidian that became Viceroy was both the chairman of the Trade Federation and of the Neimoidian Inner Circle, their power kept in check only by the rest of the Trade Federation Directorate and by Neimoidia's Trade Monarch. During Newt Gunray's time as Viceroy, this led to the slow consolidation of Trade Federation and Neimoidian interests, bringing all of Neimoidian space under Trade Federation control and, in turn, cementing Neimoidian control over the Trade Federation, as we'll discuss in greater depth later. The Viceroy of the Trade Federation was also the senior commander of the Trade Defense Force, the Trade Federation's private military. The TDF was one of the most well-known and important elements of the Trade Federation, but it changed dramatically over the course of its history. The TDF, as it was at its founding in 274 BBY, was a much different beast from the TDF of the prequel era. It was initially a small, space-based force, the Trade Federation's last resort against the pirates attacking their shipping convoys. Before founding the TDF, the Trade Federation had previously tried using the dues paid by member companies to provide funding for the cash-strapped PSFs of the sectors in which it operated. But this didn't accomplish much, and so the Directorate decided to establish its own security force that it would fund and operate on its own. The TDF was originally charged with providing security in the Trade Federation ports and escorting convoys of merchant vessels, but it soon took on larger responsibilities, providing security for entire star systems and playing a major role in the galaxy-wide battle against piracy. In its time, the Trade Defense Force was one of the most disciplined and effective military forces in the galaxy, earning the respect of the Judicials and many in the PSFs. Its personnel wore black uniforms and were drawn from a variety of sources. Originally, humans and Gran predominated the ranks of the TDF, while Neimoidians also had a noteworthy presence, mostly as officers and crew aboard capital ships, rather than in frontline roles. Over the course of its history, the TDF developed military traditions and a culture of its own. Originally, these were based on Kuadi and Balmoran traditions, but they began to become more unique as first Gran and Celestians, and then later the Neimoidians, became bigger parts of the TDF leadership. By the late 200s BBY, the Trade Defense Force was prestigious enough it became seen as an alternative to joining the Judicials or PSFs by up-and-coming naval officers. The Trade Defense Force maintained both infantry and space forces, though for most of its history, its infantry forces consisted mostly of the TDF Marines, a Balmoran-trained unit of elite soldiers primarily tasked with protecting freighters and capital ships during boarding actions and providing spaceport security. The Marines operated alongside the Trade Federation Defense Fleet, which made up the bulk of the TDF, a space navy that escorted convoys of merchant vessels and protected Trade Federation client worlds from pirate attacks. Originally, the defense fleet primarily consisted of small, fast attack craft, a mix of gunship, corvettes, and frigates, which prioritized maneuverability over firepower so as to better defend the Trade Federation's massive, slow-moving bulk freighters from nimbler raider craft. Gunboats and system patrol craft were used in-system to defend Trade Federation ports, while the highest priority convoys and systems were protected by a handful of larger, more powerful capital ship designs from Kuat drive yards. Auxilia-class pursuit destroyers, Munifex-class light cruisers, Lupus-class missile frigates, and the flagships of the TDF fleet, the Captor-class heavy munitions cruisers. The Trade Federation's initial wave of military build-up disturbed some core world politicians who began to fear that the Trade Federation was building an empire unaccountable to Republic law in the Outer Rim. However, the Trade Defense Force's regular cooperation with the Judicials in campaigns against pirates prevented these concerns from becoming mainstream, as did the fact that TDF assets were spread far and wide across the galaxy, limiting the paramilitary's utility in large-scale military actions. But the early skeptics ended up being right. As the Trade Federation changed, becoming a cartel in its own right, the TDF changed with it, becoming a vital part of the Trade Federation's business model. As the prestige of the TDF grew, the Trade Federation began promising underdefended Outer Rim systems protection against the ever-present scourge of piracy in exchange for exclusive trade agreements and other major concessions. Poor sectors with ill-equipped planetary security forces clamored for TDF protection, and the Trade Federation was all too eager to provide. At first, these agreements seemed to be beneficial to both parties. The TDF was good at its job, after all, and it did legitimately defend its clients from pirates, which led many systems to consider the concessions they made to get its protection more than worthwhile. But these sorts of arrangements also granted the Trade Federation enormous power. Systems that relied on the TDF for protection were essentially at the corporation's mercy, unable to push back against it without losing its shield against pirates and raiders. The Trade Federation basically owned these worlds, and it wasn't long before it began abusing that ownership. By 150 BBY, the Trade Federation was becoming increasingly ruthless. Its priorities shifted to domination of the galactic market, and it pursued this objective aggressively, crushing its competitors, exploiting outlying sectors, and using the TDF as a cudgel to drive away competitors and extract concessions from the Outer Rim. It had become no different from the shipping cartels it had been created to bring under control. It was a corporation in dire need of regulation and oversight, but instead of bringing the Trade Federation to heel, the Senate ultimately just gave it even more power. Around this same time, trade was beginning to dry up in the Outer Rim again, and in 124 BBY, hoping to incentivize economic development in the region, the Senate declared the entire Outer Rim a free trade zone. This meant that trade in the region was now completely exempt from regional taxes, subject only to much reduced Republic taxes that went straight to Coruscant. In 118 BBY, the free trade zones were expanded into parts of the Mid-Rim. These measures were meant to encourage companies of all sorts to do business in the Rim, but instead, it just handed the Trade Federation enormous power, allowing it to reap vast profits from Rim sectors and operate with virtually no accountability. The systems and sectors of these regions lost substantial tax revenue due to the free trade zones, which doubtlessly made funding decent planetary security forces even harder, making the Rim more dependent on the Trade Federation. To top all this off, 124 BBY also saw the Senate broaden the list of the Republic's functional constituencies, or non-state entities that were granted Senate representation, to include the Republic's most powerful guilds and corporations. This gave the Trade Federation a seat in the Senate, and in 67 BBY, the Trade Federation's Senate delegation was given equal power to the delegations of full sectors, giving the corporation enormous political as well as economic power. To nobody's great surprise, this just made many of the Republic's problems worse. The Trade Federation became even more expansionist, exploitative, and profit-hungry, and it moved aggressively into the free trade zones, driving its competitors from entire sectors and establishing complete control over trade to and from thousands of systems across the Mid and Outer Rims. It began leveraging TDF protection to establish legal sovereignty over star systems, striking agreements with numerous systems and even entire sectors that handed their Senate delegations over to the Trade Federation in exchange for not being stripped of TDF protection and blacklisted from trade with Federation-controlled companies and sectors. These sectors and systems became vassals of the Trade Federation, and as their Senate delegations were handed over to the corporation, the Trade Federation was effectively given dozens and later hundreds of votes in the Senate. Other sectors that escaped becoming Trade Federation subjects were still stripped of their economic self-determination by the corporation, becoming perpetual customers whose economies were under complete Trade Federation control. At the same time, the Trade Defense Force, which was increasingly being used to bully outlying systems into granting the Trade Federation concessions, began to slowly ramp up its militarization. It began amassing larger capital ships and replacing the TDF Marines with battle droids, which were much less likely to object to being sent to do the corporation's dirty work. The Trade Federation even began keeping the hyperspace routes its scouts discovered secret from the rest of the galaxy, using them as shortcuts to get an edge over their competitors in shipping. By the time of the Battle of Naboo, the Trade Federation's network of secret hyperspace lanes was spread all across the galaxy and gave the corporation a particular advantage in the Outer Rim. The Trade Federation's star charts were second to none, and only the Office of the Supreme Chancellor and the Jedi Order had route maps of comparable quality. By 50 BBY, the Trade Federation had indisputably become the most powerful corporation in the galaxy. It had firm economic control over the free trade zones, outright owned entire sectors of space, had the largest private military in the galaxy, and not only had Senate representation of its own, but also the votes of hundreds of sectors and systems that it had taken over. The Trade Federation controlled one of the largest Senate voting blocks, and it had enough power in Republic government that it was able to block legislation it opposed, use Senate power to secure its monopoly, and even influence the courts. The Trade Federation's increasing power earned it many enemies, but by this point, the corporation was large enough that only the Republic could rein it in, and the Republic was incapable of doing so due to the corporation's power in the Senate. Anti-Federation Senate factions, supported by the Jedi, repeatedly tried to curb the Federation's power with little success. Their failure led to less official groups taking matters into their own hand. One of these groups, the terrorist organization Nebula Front, began attacking Trade Federation shipping convoys, declaring that it would fight the Federation's encroachment into the Outer Rim by any means necessary, while another, the Stark Commercial Combine, began a similar campaign of piracy, although for more openly self-serving purposes. Neither of these groups had all that much luck in stopping the Trade Federation. Instead, their attacks just helped the Trade Federation get the Senate to allow them to increase the firepower of their fleets and the size of their newly adopted droid armies. Unbeknownst to most, this was actually the true purpose of the two groups' attacks. Both the Stark Commercial Combine and the Nebula Front were secretly operating on behalf of a being they knew as their shadow benefactor, a man who would later introduce himself to Trade Federation leadership as Lord Sidious. In fact, not all of the Trade Federation's supposed enemies even truly opposed it. The Stark Commercial Combine, a massive pirate group led by Aiko Stark, was actually a secret Trade Federation collaborator, and Stark worked together with the Federation's Viceroy Hask to engineer the Stark Hyperspace War of 44 BBY. That year, the Viceroy Hask and the Zukfra Corporation faked a major shortage of Bacta as an excuse to drive up Bacta prices, making the vital healing agent unaffordable across much of the Outer Rim. In response, the Stark's forces began raiding Trade Federation transports, stealing their Bacta cargoes and reselling them at reduced prices. This made Stark a folk hero across the Rim, but it also caused alarm in the Senate, with some in the Senate calling for war against the Stark Commercial Combine in response to the raids. Unbeknownst to all, the Trade Federation had deliberately been making Stark's raids easy, and the whole thing was designed to weaken Republic authority and increase corporate power in the Rim. Senator Finis Valorum attempted to resolve the situation by arranging a summit on Troikan between the Stark Commercial Combine and delegations from the Senate and Trade Federation. However, the summit was a complete disaster, and Troikan became the site of a full-scale battle between the Combine and Jedi-led Republic forces. During the battle, the Jedi discovered that Viceroy Hask had conspired with Stark and Zukfra to engineer the conflict, and they used this information to strong-arm the Trade Federation senator, a Nemoidian minister by the name of Newt Gunray, into giving them a TDF fleet with which to intervene in the battle on Troikan and end the war. The plot seemed to have been foiled, but the Stark Hyperspace War ultimately did exactly what Darth Sidious wanted it to do. It allowed the Trade Federation to increase the size of its armies, radicalized both the Federation and its opponents, and increased tensions between the core worlds and the Rim over the power of the Trade Federation. It also led to the resignation of Viceroy Hask, allowing for Minister Gunray's rise to power. In the years that followed the Stark Hyperspace War, the Trade Federation reached the height of its power, with influence in nearly every sector of the galaxy. Its client worlds and vassals, prominent among which were Rosha, Karimon, Sukame, Kularin, Maramir, Mirial, and Naboo, were too numerous to list, and though most were in the mid or outer rims, some were located much further coreward. The Trade Federation controlled the Iomite mines of Dorvala, droid factories on Eos and Kenachi, weapons plants on Balmora and Druckenwell, and it even had a major stake in the famed shipyards of Kuat. Some of these worlds, most notably Druckenwell and Dorvala, were fully owned by the Trade Federation, while the likes of Balmora were independent but had significant stakes in the corporation. On top of the Trade Federation's large economic sphere of influence, the Trade Defense Force had military strongholds spread far and wide across the galaxy, particularly in the Outer Rim. Remote worlds like Nod Kartha were used to house reserve military bases and R&D facilities, while regional headquarters in the Outer Rim, such as the trade world Enoch, doubled as major TDF staging areas. A number of powerful worlds in the core colonies and Inner Rim, which had contributed to the founding of the Trade Federation, retained large stakes in the corporation and acted as its allies, though they weren't beholden to it like most other Trade Federation worlds. Balmora, Kuat, Kinyan, Hock, and Nemoidia were all among these. The Trade Federation's original headquarters was in the city of Benoga on Volpta, a polluted industrial world in the deep core. Over the course of its time on Volpta, the Trade Federation took complete control of the planet, making extensive use of its industrial districts to produce consumer goods and severely polluting the planet's surface in the process. The Trade Federation used Volpta as a dumping ground for industrial waste, burying parts of its surface under mountains of trash and leaving full-on ring systems composed of garbage in orbit, devastating the planet's environment. As the Nemoidian faction grew increasingly powerful within the Trade Federation, the corporation moved its headquarters from Volpta to the city of Koto Sea on Nemoidia, leaving Volpta a poisoned and destitute world. Once relocated to Nemoidia, the Trade Federation became thoroughly intertwined with the Nemoidian government, and it began using the Nemoidian purse worlds, particularly Kato Nemoidia, Deca Nemoidia, and Koro Nemoidia, as economic and military strongholds where its leaders' palaces and vast wealth were kept. In the decade after the end of the Stark Hyperspace War, the steady Nemoidian takeover of the Trade Federation only intensified. By 33 BBY, the Nemoidian faction held more power within the Trade Federation than ever before, with Newt Gunray serving as the Federation's viceroy, fellow Nemoidian Inner Circle member Lot Dodd serving as its senator, and increasingly many Nemoidians serving all throughout the corporation's hierarchy. Despite this, Gunray was the only Nemoidian on the Trade Federation Directorate, which Gunray resented, feeling that the Directorate had only begrudgingly accepted the idea of a Nemoidian viceroy, and that it was constraining his rightful power. Even as Gunray's frustrations mounted, however, he was contacted by a man who identified himself as Lord Sidious, who promised to strengthen Gunray's control over the Trade Federation and bring him profit beyond his wildest dreams if the Viceroy entered into a partnership with him. Gunray agreed to work with Sidious, and after Sidious proved his ability to help Gunray by helping him take over the mining world Dorvala, Gunray began to collaborate with Sidious on a scheme to further militarize the Trade Federation. Around the same time, the Nebula Front began ramping up its attacks on the Trade Federation. In 33 BBY, it stole billions of credits in Aurodium ingots from the cargo hold of a Trade Federation bulk freighter above Dorvala, sparking furor in the Senate and outrage from Trade Federation leadership. The Directorate ordered Lot Dodd to petition the Senate to yet again raise the cap on the Trade Federation's droid armies, claiming that further deregulation was necessary to secure Federation shipments from Nebula Front attacks. But this time, the Senate was hesitant to grant this request, not without concessions from the Trade Federation. Concerns that the Trade Federation was becoming an unaccountable empire were becoming much more widespread in the Senate, and in response to Dodd's demands, Supreme Chancellor Valorum, on the suggestion of Senator Palpatine, proposed a compromise. The Trade Federation would be allowed to increase the size of its armies, but in exchange, the Senate would resume taxation of the mid and outer rims, effectively abolishing the free trade zones. The Trade Federation strongly opposed this measure, and the Senate deadlocked. Valorum tried to resolve the impasse by calling for a summit on Eriadu to discuss the proposed legislation, which the Trade Federation agreed to. In the meantime, however, Darth Sidious ordered Gunray to begin building his new droid army anyway, without waiting for Senate approval. This was illegal, obviously, and consequently, this build-up was carried out in secret by Gunray and his followers in the Nemoidian faction, which kept the Directorate and the rest of the Trade Federation in the dark about the build-up. While the Directorate was led to believe that Gunray was just overseeing the replacement of the Federation's existing, outdated battle droids with newer models, Gunray was actually amassing a full droid army, striking deals with Bactoid Industries, Haochal Engineering, and the Colicoid Creation Nest to design new war machines for the Trade Federation's use. Under the Neimoidians' purview, the Trade Federation amassed a whole new army, ostensibly under the purview of the Trade Defense Force, but in practice only controlled by a Neimoidian faction within the TDF. This Trade Federation droid army primarily consisted of B-1 and OOM series battle droids designed by Bactoid Combat Automata, supported by tougher Bactoid E-4 Baron droids and Colicoid W series droidicas. These troops were ferried across battlefields by PACs and the more heavily armored MTTs, both produced by Bactoid Armor Workshop. In turn, these were escorted by STAPs for recon duties and AATs for added firepower, which were also produced by Bactoid Armor Workshop. These units were ferried to planetary surfaces by Howard Chal-designed C-9979 landing craft, which were derived from the design of Trade Federation ore haulers. Howard Chal also produced tens of thousands of fearsome vulture droids for the Trade Federation's use. Agile droid starfighters that could provide air support for the droid army, armed escorts for landing craft, and fighter wings for the Trade Federation's capital ships. All of these were carried through space by a fleet of Lucrehulk class battleships, converted bulk freighters that had been armed with quad laser batteries and had their hangars converted to house massive numbers of battle droids. Each of these titanic battleships carried 50 C-9979s, hundreds of thousands of battle droids in their support vehicles, and 5,000 vulture droids. As both a final cost-saving measure and a means of providing the droid army with added coordination, every last one of these units was controlled from an enormous central control computer hosted in the core of a specialized Lucrehulk battleship. The Trade Federation droid army followed a simple but effective order of battle that was later adopted for use by the Separatist droid army. It was designed based on the carrying capacity of the droid army's transports, and it had 9 main levels of organization. The basic unit of the Trade Federation droid army was the Squad, which consisted of 8 B-1 battle droids. Squads were organized into platoons of 7 squads each, for a total of 56 battle droids. Squads and platoons were micromanaged directly by the central control computer, and thus lacked droid officers, unlike the organizational levels above them. 2 platoons made up a company of 112 droids total, which was the total carrying capacity of 1 multi-troop transport or platoon attack craft. Companies were commanded by battle droid officers, and apart from their commanders and component battle droids, they included the pilots of the company transports and a few maintenance droids as support personnel. There were 2 kinds of companies, distinguished by the kind of transport they were assigned to. PAC companies were assigned to the lighter platoon attack crafts. These were generally reserve or midline units, more lightly equipped and backed by fewer support droids. MTT companies were assigned to the more densely armored multi-troop transports. These were the frontline troops, well supported and meant to be deployed directly into hot zones by their heavily armored carriers. Companies were sorted into battalions and vanguards, with battalions composed of 7 companies for a total of 784 battle droids, and vanguards containing 11 companies for a total of 1,232 battle droids, plus a legion of support units. Battalions made up the core and reserves of attack forces and only consisted of lighter PAC companies, while vanguards consisted of MTT companies and led the charge into battle. Both were commanded by droid officers and also included a squadron of armored assault tanks, 24 for battalions and 18 for vanguards. 4 battalions and 1 vanguard represented the maximum carrying capacity of a C-997 landing craft, and this combined force was called a regiment. Regiments contained 4,368 battle droids plus support droids, 11 MTTs, 28 PACs, 114 AATs, and a number of STAPs, all commanded by a droid officer. 5 regiments made up a division which consisted of 21,840 battle droids carried by a section of 5 C-997 landing craft, and 5 divisions made up a corps, consisting of 109,200 battle droids and a squadron of 25 C-9979s. Divisions and corps were usually commanded by organic officers, or in rare cases, specialized droid commanders. 2 corps made up an army, containing a total of 218,400 battle droids and a horde of support droids carried by 50 C-9979s. This was the total ground force carried aboard your average Lucrehulk class battleship, and it was commanded by the battleship's captain. In 33 BBY and into early 32 BBY, Neimoidian commanders within the TDF oversaw live fire tests of the Droid Army in remote Trade Federation controlled systems across wild space, far from the watchful eyes of Republic regulators. On the worlds of the Carthax system and several others, the new Droid Army proved itself to be battle ready and was approved for deployment at Viceroy Gunray's command. Meanwhile, Gunray and the rest of the Trade Federation Directorate gathered for the Eriadu Trade Summit, escorted by the new B-1 battle droids for their protection. Delegates from the Senate, the Trade Federation, and numerous other factions gathered on Eriadu for the summit, as did Nebula Front assassins, whom Darth Sidious had ordered to disrupt the talks. The summit had just barely begun when a Nebula Front sniper took a shot at Supreme Chancellor Valorum. He missed, but the blaster fire caused the automatic activation of a ray shield to protect the Trade Federation Directorate, and once the shield was raised, the Directorate's own battle droids turned on it. With the Jedi and everyone else in the room helpless to intervene, the droids massacred 6 of the 7 members of the Directorate, everyone except Gunray, who was out of the room at the time. This, of course, was precisely the outcome Darth Sidious had intended. As the sole remaining member of the Trade Federation Directorate, Newt Gunray now had complete control over the Trade Federation. He stacked the empty seats on the Directorate with the other leaders of the Neimoidian faction, including Chief Settlement Officer Rune Harko, Deputy Viceroy Hearth Monchar, Trade Federation Senator Lot Dodd, and TDF Captain Dulte Dauphine. With the Trade Federation now under complete Neimoidian control, Gunray finished amassing, testing, and mobilizing the secret droid army, which was now considerably larger than it was legally allowed to be. In the furor after the trade summit, the Senate passed Valorum's proposed tax on the free trade zones over the objections of the Trade Federation. The Trade Federation's profit took a serious hit over the next few months, and on the urging of Darth Sidious, Gunray and his new directorate of Yes Men prepared to use military force to protest it. Gunray initially wanted to target Eriadu, but Sidious suggested an easier target, Naboo, the homeworld of the senator who had proposed the tax bill in the first place. Gunray agreed, and the Trade Federation began mobilizing its forces at Enoch, receiving a few final shipments from Charos 4, Esselis, and Colifor before initiating the blockade of Naboo. As the Trade Federation fleet cut off all shipping to and from Naboo, debate erupted in the Senate. The Federation demanded that the tax on the free trade zone be revoked in exchange for an end to the blockade, and the Senate was immediately divided on the issue, squabbling endlessly while Naboo starved. Gunray felt confident that the Senate would soon cave, but the situation became more complicated when the Supreme Chancellor dispatched a pair of Jedi Knights to negotiate an end to the dispute. The Trade Federation was forced to accelerate its plans and occupy Naboo. After the fleet in orbit cut off Naboo's communications, the droid army landed on the planet's surface and quickly captured Theed, the planetary capital, and with it, Naboo's ruler, Queen Amidala. The planet came under the direct rule of Viceroy Gunray and the Trade Federation Occupation Council, who instituted martial law and cracked down hard on the Naboo. With Naboo in his grip, Gunray attempted to pressure Amidala to sign a treaty legitimizing the occupation, but she refused and escaped the planet with the help of the Jedi. In an attempt to force her to concede, Lord Sidious ordered Gunray to relocate the Naboo to camps and starve the planet out. This effort was ultimately unsuccessful. Instead, Amidala covertly returned home, made peace with the Gungans, and initiated the Battle of Naboo, a daring ploy to retake the planet. As part of Amidala's plan, the Gungan Grand Army rallied and marched toward Theed, and as Gunray dispatched the bulk of the droid army to stop its advance, Amidala, her royal guard, and the Jedi infiltrated the city with the help of the Naboo resistance. They stormed the royal palace, hoping to capture Viceroy Gunray and the Occupation Council, while Naboo's pilots took their starfighters and attacked the droid control ship in orbit. The Gungan Grand Army suffered heavy losses in its battle with the droid army, but after Anakin destroyed the droid control ship, all droid army units were deactivated, and Queen Amidala captured Viceroy Gunray. The Battle of Naboo ended in a crushing defeat for the Trade Federation, which was subjected to punitive measures from the Republic for the crimes it had carried out on Naboo. However, these punishments were much lighter than what the Naboo expected and the Trade Federation deserved. Though many hoped the Senate would revoke the Federation's trade franchise, this never happened, and most of the Trade Federation officials involved in the occupation never received any serious legal accountability. Even after 4 trials in the Supreme Court, Nute Gunray remained Viceroy, while Rune Harko remained his top lieutenant. The Trade Federation kept its Senate seat, which Lot Dod continued to fill. Of the leaders of the Nemoidian faction, the only one to face any consequences was Dolte Dauphine, the captain of the blockade's flagship, who was killed when the droid control ship was destroyed. Nonetheless, the Battle of Naboo was a serious blow to the Trade Federation. Many of the Federation's former clients and member companies abandoned it in protest of the blockade and occupation, most notably Kuat Drive Yards, and the Judicial Forces dismantled the Trade Federation's military forces. The Judicials seized parts of the Trade Federation Droid Army for their own use and ordered the Federation to destroy the rest, as well as its fleet of battleships. Most of the non-droid elements of the Trade Defense Force met a similar fate. The disarmament was ultimately short-lived, however. The Trade Federation suffered for a few years after the Battle of Naboo, but thanks to its monopoly over trade across the Rim, it steadily rebounded, especially as the Separatist crisis began. As sectors began seceding from the Republic to join the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the Trade Federation began to expand its operations in Separatist space, where regulations were lax and it was given a free hand to do pretty much whatever it wanted. As it did so, it secretly began rebuilding its military forces. Between 24 and 22 BBY, the Trade Federation, together with a number of other powerful megacorporations, ordered a new droid army from the Geonosians, one that would be larger and stronger than ever before. It also began rebuilding its fleet, converting the cores of its Lucrehulk-class transports into detachable, combat-capable core ships, which packed the functionality of the old Lucrehulk-class battleships into the core while leaving the outer rings unconverted, concealing the vessel's rearmament. The Trade Federation also began buying smaller warships to flesh out its fleet, most notably Providence-class carrier/destroyers, which were secretly produced at Permont docks for the rebuilt Trade Defense Force. As the Trade Federation rearmed, Viceroy Gunray was approached by Count Dooku, who tried to convince the Viceroy to join the Separatist cause. Gunray agreed to side with Dooku with the Confederacy on the condition that Dooku assassinate now Senator Padme Amidala for him. After Amidala was captured on Geonosis and sentenced to a public execution, Gunray and the leaders of several other corporate factions officially committed to supporting the CIS, signing a treaty that pooled their private armies into the Separatist Droid Army. Shortly thereafter, the Republic's new clone army invaded Geonosis to capture the droid factories there, and the Clone Wars began, with the Trade Federation Droid Army now committed to the Separatist side. Some elements of the Trade Federation claimed neutrality in the Clone Wars, claiming that Nute Gunray and the commanders of the Trade Federation Droid Army were radicals that they had nothing to do with. These factions of the Trade Federation continued operations in Republic space, and they continued to be represented by Lot Dod in the Senate. However, the vast majority of the Trade Federation military, as well as the bulk of its vassals, clients, and leaders, openly sided with the Confederacy, and even those elements of the Trade Federation that claimed neutrality were still secretly separatist aligned. The openly separatist factions of the Trade Federation played a major role in the Clone Wars, supplying a larger portion of the CIS military's droids, warships, and funding than any other separatist corporation. Most Trade Federation worlds seceded and joined the Confederacy, and the Trade Federation leveraged its control of hyperspace routes and trade in the Outer Rim to persuade non-Federation sectors to secede as well. But the Clone Wars didn't go well for the Trade Federation. The conflict cost the organization an enormous amount of credits, more than it reaped through the exploitation of conquered worlds, and its military forces suffered heavy casualties. As the war went on and separatist forces were driven into the Outer Rim, many Trade Federation worlds were conquered by the Republic, and the corporation's influence was purged from them. Nemoidia and the Nemoidian Purse worlds all fell to the JAR in the last months of the war, and many prominent TDF officers, such as Captain Lashros Dauphine and General Locke Durd, were killed or captured by the Republic. In the final weeks of the war, Nute Gunray, Rune Harko, and many other Trade Federation leaders were forced to flee to Utapau and then to Mustafar to avoid capture by the Republic. Viceroy Gunray briefly became the Confederacy's head of state after the death of General Grievous, but his reign was short-lived. Not long after Grievous's death, Gunray received a transmission from Lord Sidious, who told him that the war was over and ordered him to remotely deactivate the entire CIS droid army. Gunray complied, officially bringing an end to the Clone Wars. Shortly thereafter, the Separatist Council's compound on Mustafar was stormed by Darth Vader, who massacred Gunray, Harko, and their allies. The end of the Clone Wars meant defeat for the CIS and the Trade Federation by extension, while the death of Gunray and Harko threw the corporation's upper leadership into chaos. Initially, nobody knew what had happened to the Separatist Council, and Gunray and Harko were simply written off as missing. However, as they were apparently unresponsive, a Trade Federation official on Nemoidia, Centipeth Findos, took the position of acting viceroy and assumed control of the corporation. Findos initially resisted the newly formed Galactic Empire, refusing to acknowledge the Confederacy's defeat and attempting to reactivate the droid army. A few days after the declaration of a new order, however, Imperial clone stormtroopers attacked Findos's compound in Kodosai and captured the acting viceroy, whom they forced to sign a treaty, turning the Trade Federation and all of its resources over to the direct control of the Imperial Senate. The Trade Federation was nationalized and largely liquidated, with its various assets seized by the Empire and either taken for Imperial use or sold off to pro-Imperial corporations. The Trade Federation Directorate was dissolved, its Senate representation was abolished, and all of its vassals and client worlds were released from their contracts, though most promptly came under similar oppression from Imperial corporations or the Imperial military. The Trade Federation nominally persisted as an arm of the Imperial Senate until the Senate was dissolved in 0 BBY, but in practice, it had ceased to exist long before that. A few elements within the Trade Federation refused to acknowledge Findos's treaty and began a campaign of resistance against the Empire. These were led by Marath Vuru, a Trade Federation customs vizier assigned to the military staging hub on Enoch, where Vuru rallied his supporters and reactivated several separatist fleets and droid armies. Vuru and his Trade Federation resistance attempted to use their reactivated armies to defend former separatist space rimward of Naboo from Imperial encroachment, but Vuru's separatist holdout was hindered by lack of effective officers. In 19 ABY, the Trade Federation resistance was utterly crushed in the Five Veils campaign, which saw future Grand Admiral Octavian Grant smash Vuru's forces at Farstein before pursuing them down the Five Veils run to the Hook Nebula, where the rest of the fleet was destroyed and Marath Vuru was captured. Vuru's short-lived campaign was the last action the Trade Defense Force ever took, and with his capture, the Trade Federation was left to be dismantled by the Empire. So that's our look at the structure, history, territory, and leadership of the Trade Federation. But what do you think? Is there anything more about the Trade Federation you'd like us to cover in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.